It's the SNL Hall of Fame podcast with your host, Jamie Dew, Chief Librarian Thomas Senna, and featuring Matt Ardill. And now, curator of the hall, Jamie Dew.
Oh boy, am I excited this week. I am so excited I almost forgot to say hello. Hi, my name's Jamie Dew, and this is the SNL Hall of Fame podcast. Please, before you enter, wipe your feet. We've got a quality shine to these floors that we have to maintain, you know, in these situations. How are you doing? I hope you're well. I mentioned off the top that I'm excited, and I'm excited because today we're talking about Jen Hooks, who is quite possibly my first comedy crush. I started watching SNL in or around 1986, and I remember just being smitten right away that this person could be so lovely, so talented, and so funny. So there's that. I hope you are ready to have your socks knocked off, because we've got Bill Kenney from the SNL Network joining us, and he will be having a conversation with Thomas about Ms. Hooks. But before we get into that, let's go over to our friend Matt Ardill and Matt's Minutia Minute. Matt, how are you doing this week?
I am great, thanks, Jamie. And you?
I'm excited. Jen Hooks, right?
Yeah. Jen, she's an amazing performer. She was born in April 23rd, 1957. She passed away on October 9th of 2014, sadly, to leukemia. But she was an incredible performer, really respected by her peers. Her first season was in October. Her first episode was on October 11th of 1986 in season 12. This was during the Phil Hartman, Dana Carvey, Victoria Jackson, John Lovitz era. That was the year that A. Whitney Brown and Kevin Nealon first started as featured players. And she went in only for 4 seasons, actually. I had always felt longer, but her last episode was May 18th of 1991. When she retired. But after that, she did do 9, she was back as a special guest 9 times between 1992 and 1994.
9 times.
So it was an interesting period that she was on, because that was during that post Dick Ebersol period where I think Lorne was still trying to figure it out. He was experimenting with formatting. Had like the middle players segment that they only really had for like 3 or 4 years.
That's right.
She went straight to a repertory player. She was actually originally supposed to be a part of the infamous Robert Downey Jr. Era, but she was passed up as, the rumor is Lorne said she was too old, but she was passed up for Joan Cusack. And when they burnt that cast to the ground, they came back and said, "Hey, would you be interested in joining the cast?" So,
what a good day that was.
Yeah, and they were much better for it, because she is an incredible. Nothing against Joan. I love you in all of your brother's movies and the movies that you've done on your own. You're a wonderful performer, Joan, but not quite the right fit for SNL, I don't think. Yeah, she has some great characters, like the Candy Sweeney of the Sweeney Sisters.
Yes.
Marge Keister, Miss Connie, but I have to say, I always loved her impressions, like Ivana Trump, Nancy Reagan. Tammy Faye Baker was spot on.
It was so great.
It was, yeah. I mean, she was in all sorts of other things. I mean, she was a groundling along with Paul Reubens and Phil Hartman. She had a very strong relationship with Phil. Who's kind of her rock in many interviews, how she would discuss how he would help her through stage fright before shows. And, she was in Pee-wee's Big Adventure. she was in The Simpsons for the longest time as well. And yeah, she even dated Kevin Nealon prior to joining SNL. So they were dating as she went into SNL,
Oh,
which would
wow.
have made for a weird dynamic, I think, on set when your when your boyfriend is on set with you. But yeah, and they remained pretty close. So she was a really interesting and incredible player.
Yeah, I agree. One of my favorites, really. Tried to get her onto the list last year. This year it was really easy when we met with the Board of Governors. They were like, Jen Hooks has to be nominated. So
Yeah, yeah. And she is one of those people who can play so silly, but can also like there's a film, um, Love Is a Dream that they
yes,
played when both she passed away and when Phil passed away. And it's one of those things where it's like, she can play melancholy. Like they
yeah.
don't do that as much anymore. Like in the early years, they would have the shorts, and sometimes they could get dark and weird
And
and
sometimes just very
melancholy.
sweet.
Yeah, and I mean, this sort of fit into that. Like, oh, this is lovely,
Yeah.
and I mean, it just speaks to the power of both her and Phil as performers that they could create this sweet 3 minute, 3.5 minute video that just transports you. And not every SNL cast member can say they can do that. Like there are some, but there are a lot who would be too busy looking for the gag in the moment to be able to bring you that.
Yeah, she was one of a kind.
Indeed.
All right, Bill Kenney, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me. Been looking forward to talking about Jan for a long time, and it's been a fun deep dive back into her career, which I like to do anyway. So,
Yeah, no, it was very fun for me too, and I know we've had a lot of discussions recently, actually, about like Jan Hooks. So you're the perfect person. When we knew that we wanted to cover Jan Hooks this season, I immediately said Bill Kenney's going to be my guest. So happy to have you today.
well, thank you, So happy to be here.
Yeah, so Jan Hooks is a Georgia girl. I want to talk a little bit about her pre-SNL days. She got her start on TV. I guess she was one of the people who, before SNL, actually did a little television sketch comedy. So can you kind of set the table for people as far as what Jan Hooks' career looked like before she got to SNL?
Yeah, it's actually pretty interesting, especially for the times, because it was kind of a very different world back then. Obviously, cable was just getting started, and no YouTube, no internet, obviously. But Jan found a way on. She had started at the Groundlings, where so many of the greatest SNL of all time have started. But then she ended up on this little remembered but very funny show called Tush. And it was a guy who worked for Ted Turner on the burgeoning WTBS Superstation in Atlanta. And it was just this kind of weird, crazy sketch show. And she couldn't have been more than 23, 24 years old, if that. And you can already see at that point what she's going to become. She had the comedy chops, as they say, right out of the gate. No issues with being funny, and no matter what she was put in, whether the sketch was funny or not, she was funny. And that only lasted for a year, but then she moved on to the little more remembered, not necessarily the news,
Yes.
on HBO.
Yes.
And she had a little bit more luck on there, and then ended up on SNL in '86. So
Yeah, so I imagine Tush was maybe, I kind of liken it a little bit in my mind to what NWA wrestling or like WCW was to like TBS. Like maybe Ted Turner wasn't as hands-on. Would that be fair to say?
That's-
Is that, as
yeah,
far as like,
yeah,
he kind of let them have their playground to kind of do whatever they want.
Yeah, and I mean, the funny story behind Bill Tush himself is that he was hired on TBS because Ted Turner was told he had to do a news show if he wanted to be a superstation. He wasn't told what time of day it had to be on or anything like that. So he did this news show at like 3:30 in the morning and turned it into a comedy show. And that was so it was almost like Ted owed him a favor after that and kind of just let him play. And again, I mean, not as many people. I don't think TBS was in nearly as many homes at the time. It was a superstation for maybe a year at that point. You know, it wasn't as nationwide known as it became in the mid 80s.
So we're going to give people in the Atlanta area a chance. We're going to give them a little creative space to kind of do this show here. Exactly. Yeah. And growing up too, I remember you had mentioned not necessarily the news. That's something that I watched a lot as kind of a weird 8-year-old comedy fan.
Same.
You mentioned an 8-year-old watching not necessarily the news, but I enjoyed it. And just as a refresher, like how would you describe not necessarily the news?
It was almost like a prehistoric Daily Show. You know, they did this set behind a news desk, but then they would throw it to correspondents out in the field and things like that. And it was on HBO, so there was no censorship. There was no, rules about anything. So, and HBO was really starting to get into, doing some of these shows like that. They had First and 10. They had this show. So this was kind of the beginning of HBO finding their original programming. And they also were able to kind of do whatever they wanted to do.
Yeah, exactly. And you also there's some SNL ties there too. You had Rich Hall, who was a cast member on there, Conan O'Brien, Greg Daniels was a part of it, Harry Shearer. I think post SNL, Harry Shearer had some involvement in not necessarily the news. So yeah, and I guess, for a long time there, I didn't even realize Jan was a part of that show. So two things that I enjoyed, I didn't know were actually connected.
Right. Kind of blows your mind when you're younger, right?
Yeah, no kidding. All sorts of stuff. Yeah. So after, Tush and not necessarily the news, we get Jan starting off at SNL. So you're an SNL historian. How would you characterize where the show was around the time Jan started on SNL? Where was the show?
Well, the funny thing, I always say this because everybody always says, your favorite cast is the one when you were in high school or middle school. And that is true for me as well. But I often wonder if I had been a fan just 2 or 3 years earlier, would I have become a super fan and a historian? Because, boy, it was in a bad place. Lorne Michaels had come back in 85 and actually rejected Jan in favor of Joan Cusack, which is funny in itself. But season 11, which preceded Jan and the rest of them coming on, was an outright disaster other than Jon Lovitz. And for the first time in its history, it only got renewed for 13 episodes. It wasn't guaranteed a full season. It was in a lot of trouble. And it's very rarely been on that kind of chopping block. You could say after season 20 that it kind of was teetering as well. But it's very rarely been like, oh, this show might go away.
Yeah, people talk about Saturday Night Dead, and that was literally almost literally about to happen around that time. And as a refresher for people, that was the season where I guess Lorne really experimented, so he brought in people who already had names like Anthony Michael Hall, Robert Downey Jr. Damon Wayans was in the cast before he got fired.
Randy Quaid.
Randy Quaid, Joan Cusack, as you mentioned. So it was a lot of people maybe who were already established, and Lorne was just kind of experimenting with that season. And as you mentioned, it was a disaster. And at the end of the season, Lorne almost literally just kind of set the season on fire.
That's right. Final sketch has Billy Martin as the host setting the stage on fire, and Lorne famously comes in and only saves Lovitz.
Billy, what are you doing?
I'm setting the room on fire. That's what I'm doing.
What do you mean?
What do I mean? Listen, Michaels, if I'm fired, then I'm taking the cast with me.
Billy, are you crazy? If you set the cast on fire, they won't be able to do the show next year.
That's right, Big Shot.
I've got to go in there.
What are you
doing? I gotta wave goodbye.
Don't ask any questions, John. Just go downstairs to my limousine and wait for me there.
While Nora and Dennis ended up surviving as well, that was kind of the like, okay, this is done now.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, everybody remembers that Lovitz got saved, but you're right. Dennis Miller got saved. Ultimately, not in the sketch, but in real life, he got saved, and also, as you mentioned, Nora Dunn was one of the holdovers. So we go into season 12, and I think that's actually a really good segue to start talking about Jan Hook's work on SNL. Right away, we see chemistry that she had with Nora Dunn.
Yes.
What do you remember about that partnership?
It's so crazy to look back on it. And, there was so much talk this past season about James Austin Johnson coming out of the gate. Back in the day when there was an entirely new cast mostly, these people had to kind of put themselves out there and become stars immediately. And, the cast was tiny. It was 7 people plus 1 featured player. So there was no choice but to be funny right out of the gate. And you had Dana Carvey doing his, chopping broccoli in the first episode, and you had Phil Hartman in so many different things. But Jan she was in the background in a few things that first episode, but by the second episode is when we see the Sweeney sisters for the first time. And that's probably the most remembered character that Jan had.
Yeah, definitely. She and Nora Dunn, of course, the Sweeney sisters, they did that 10 different times on the show throughout a few seasons. I think that was the most sketches that Jan did that was recurring.
Yes.
Was as part of the Sweeney sisters. And as you mentioned, that was in her second episode that she and Nora did that. And Nora Dunn has said that she and Jan actually had to fight for the sketch because the writers said it was too much like Nick the Lounge Singer, of course,
right.
The famous Bill Murray character. But then everybody fell in love with it at read-through. Can you speak on kind of the similarities, but also ultimately differences between the Sweeney sisters and Nick the Lounge Singer?
I mean, you can't deny the similarities. Mm-hmm. There's obviously, this lounge fly kind of singer who's, riffing off of whatever current music or whatever place he's in and going out to the crowd. And there was that aspect of it. But Jan and Nora had the combo. They had the duo of each other to play off of. And I think that in itself made it so much different. And they found a way to, where Nick was often in a bar, these guys were everywhere. They were in a Jewish retirement home. They were in a jail cell. They were in a ski lodge.
They hosted a Christmas party.
Exactly. And actually, the first episode, I mean, you can see these characters are almost fully formed right from the start, even though they're not called the same thing. I forget I think their names were Marianne and Fran or something like that. But other than that, and everything else about these characters was already in place. Yeah, I mean, they played off each other so well. My favorite out of those has to be the Paul Simon one. Paul Simon's kind of trying to hide out in this, ski lodge, and he doesn't want to be bothered by people. And of course, they turn it right into a Paul Simon medley of songs and, sing to him and go over to the table. And Jan famously goes over and sings Bridge Over Troubled Water. And then they always end it with, clang, clang, clang went the trolley. And
yeah, that was kind of the famous, if there was a catchphrase, I guess.
Right.
With the Sweeney sisters, that would be it. And they were so darn charming to Paul Simon that he started, the bit was that he was like, nah, I just kind of want to be in the background. And then they actually got him to participate.
That's right. That's right.
In the song.
Hop off the bus, Gus.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
We'd like to help you with your problem to be free. There must be 50 ways to leave your lover. Just slip out the back.
Jack.
Yeah! Just make a new plan.
Stan.
No need to be coy.
Roy.
Right! Just listen to me.
What was it specifically about Jan that kind of popped out to you? It could be the Sweeney sisters or just kind of like when you first started noticing her, kind of just what popped out.
Oh, she was game for anything. And, I think, one of the things that she did differently than the 6 years prior to her on SNL, that's one of the dark secrets, dark sides of SNL was that from 80 to 86, there wasn't a lot of work for the women on the show. And the very talented Mary Gross and Robin Duke and Julia Louis-Dreyfus were relegated to housewives and these background roles for the most part. And it was a shame. And that's one of the reasons why I think Jan is so important to the history of the show, because she didn't do it by herself, but being part of such a great cast, and she differentiated herself and made herself stand out, especially among the female cast. Her impressions were fantastic. Tammy Faye Bakker obviously is, she famously says in the Live from New York book that she suggested it at the beginning when she was on the show, and nobody knew who this woman was. She was just this person down in the South, but then the scandal broke in early '87 in her first season, and she got to do it, and famously did it on Church Chat.
Well, thank you, Church Lady. It was kind of you to invite us here.
And I just want to thank all our partners for all their love and their support and their prayers.
So Tammy Faye Bakker was someone who Jan would see on television.
That's
and
right.
Thought was just this outrageous character. But then, of course, Tammy Faye's husband, Jim Bakker, got caught up in a scandal. And so
Right.
great excuse for Jan to pull that one out. And on Church Chat for Jim to get shamed by the church lady.
That's right.
That all coalesced. That was perfect timing. Thank you so much for bringing up that point about Jan and her role, because back then we're talking like mid 80s, there was still, so much misogyny, especially in the comedy world. That whole ridiculous notion that women aren't funny or whatever still permeated the comedy world. Like, it was definitely a boys' club. So that's such a great point about Jan, and to another extent, Nora, but Jan's role in kind of breaking through right there. That's such a salient observation.
Yeah, I think that is one of the most important things. That we were right at the point of comedy in general finally getting to the point of acknowledging women. With Roseanne Barr getting her own show, her own sitcom, and then Elaine Boozler and things of that nature. But Jan was definitely at the forefront of that. So
yes, definitely. Well, since we're on the subject of Jan's partnership with Nora Dunn, I want to continue this. But first, I have, leading into this, I have a little game for you. Bill, are you ready? I'm just kind of springing a game on you.
Oh, boy.
All right. So you've played.
I was told there'd be no math.
You've played Two Truths and a Lie. I'm sure you know. Do you know what that is?
I believe I do.
All right. So I'm going to name. Okay. So this is going to be related to Attitudes, the sketch that Jan and Nora did together.
Yes.
And so I'm going to say three things, and two of them will be true and one of them will be a lie, and you have to spot the lie.
Okay. Yeah.
Alrighty. So in Attitudes, that sketch usually featured eccentric guests that Nora and Jan would interview.
Yes.
So which one of these statements is a lie? John Malkovich appeared on Attitudes as Len Tuckwilla, and he was a driftwood sculptor. Ted Danson appeared on Attitudes as Arnold Tellman, and he made wicker ornaments. And Woody Harrelson appeared on Attitudes as Paul Tinso, and he made clay miniatures. So which one of those is false?
I know Malkovich is true for sure. I'm going to say Ted Danson.
Ted Danson did not appear on Attitudes as a wicker ornament maker?
Yes.
You're correct. Yes. Yeah. So John Malkovich appeared on Attitudes. Great job, Bill. See, you were flustered at the beginning, but I knew you had it. So John Malkovich appeared as a driftwood sculptor. Woody Harrelson appeared as clay miniatures. Just for extra credit, do you remember the other guests?
Gina Davis, for sure.
Mm-hmm. She collected vintage items for presumably a thrift store.
That's the only one I can remember off the top of my head, yeah.
And then they had Christopher Walken on, who was Rainbow Head, who was a big sports fan. Yeah, and that's kind of the one that actually really stood out to me.
Okay.
Was when Christopher Walken was on. So those Attitudes, for me, as much as the Sweeney Sisters, the Attitudes sketches, which was based on a real show.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, those Attitudes sketches really resonated with me. Do you have fond memories of those?
Well, it's funny because it's not a show that I ever would have watched on my own, but I can remember coming home from school and my mother would have that on Lifetime. And I was kind of amazed at how well both Jan and Nora were able to nail these two women. Linda Dana and I can't think of her last name, but her first name was Dee, the one that Jan played. Yeah.
Yeah, and one of my favorite things was how they had these eccentric guests on, but them as host, Nora and Jan as host, kind of shuffled between genuine interest and almost like mocking sort of sarcasm.
Right.
And I couldn't tell where they were necessarily at any given point during the interview, because Nora would do her lean in and seem real fascinated, and then Jan would talk about this really mundane topic, just super excited.
Now, you have become the hottest new artist on the West Coast. Now, tell us what you do and how you've done it.
Actually, I'm from the Pacific Northwest, Bothell, Washington.
Oh, and what are you doing out there in the art community that's just blowing
their
everybody
minds?
away?
I'm a driftwood sculptor.
It was just such wonderful, I don't know, like they would have just such great turns of phrase. And was there something about Jan in those attitude sketches that made her endearing to you as much as she was to me?
Well, she was the second banana both on the actual show and on the parody of the show, and she kind of let Nora just run away with it, and she didn't mind being in the background in that sense, and showing the empathy to these guests as Linda Dana was, leaning in, and
yes. Yeah, she's such a great facial actor too, Jan.
Yeah.
Just in those attitude sketches. That's why I say I couldn't tell if it was sarcastic or not, and it might have been both at the same time, both genuine interest and sarcasm. But Jan just had this big bright smile on her face, like, "Yeah, I'm listening. This is so interesting." And she was just so endearing, man. Gosh. So yeah, I'm gonna kind of let you run with wherever you think we should go next.
Well, I mean, the one that she's not most famous for, but definitely up there, was the Brenda the Waitress sketch with Nora and Alec Baldwin, and Phil and Kevin are diners at the time. And she goes back and forth. You talk about this with attitudes. She was able to go back between being sweet to these two, very sweet diner restaurant customers.
Sweet and simple.
Yes. And then turning a couple of feet and talking to Alec and, flirting / fighting with this guy who comes in off the street, and, the double entendre of it all, there's free pie with your meal. You shouldn't give away your pie with breakfast. It makes you look cheap. And, this is one of Alec's first time hosting, and it showed what a great host he was going to become. But she really carries this sketch, and she just had that ability to go from, turn it on and do another kind of attitude with the sketch. So that was amazing to me what she was able to do in this.
Oh, man. His type just makes me crazy. Phew. Look at him sitting on that stool like he's doing it a favor. Well, you know what? He can just sit there forever as far as I'm concerned. I just don't care. However, my job description requires me to go down and find out exactly what he wants.
Yeah, I love that one. And it was almost like there were a handful of characters that I loved from her that were like Southern belles, but with sass.
Yeah.
And Jan she did that so well.
Nobody played a waitress like Jan.
Nobody played a waitress like Jan.
And nobody played a whore like Jan. She joked on the 15th anniversary that she had just broken the record for playing 4 whores in one episode, a record previously held by Buck Henry. So that was
that's right. Yeah, it's good for you, Jan. Definitely. Another partnership that I'd like to talk about. We talked about her chemistry and partnership with Nora Dunn, which popped on screen. Another one was with Phil Hartman.
Yeah.
That I think that she was like very well known for.
Oh, I would put them up there with the best duos of all time in SNL history. She had a very famous stage fright, kind of along the lines of Bill Hader, where every show she was terrified to go on the stage, and she would talk about how Phil would grab her hand before a sketch and help her get out there and get over that fear. And this is why they were bonded together so often. You know, she played so many roles with him, Bill and Hillary, and Ron and Nancy, and Jim and Tammy Faye, as we've talked about. But then they could just be in a sketch as husband and wife. They had such a great, playful way of working together, and elevating each other's games. And you know, Phil is up there with one of the greatest cast members of all time as well. So the fact that these two people were working together on a weekly basis was a treat.
Yeah, definitely. I'm reminded immediately, one that I really remember when I was a kid was The Honest Man with Joe Montana, when Phil Hartman and Jan were on a date, and they had their inner monologues going that were saying what they were really thinking, and then Joe Montana comes in and kind of says this kind of famous line that he tells them that if they need him, he's going to be in his room masturbating.
That's right.
So that was a great chemistry between Phil and Jan right there, like you said. And of course, Love is a Dream is the Phil and Jan sketch. Tell us about Love is a Dream.
Well, I mean, it's such a sad kind of segue that the last time Jan was on stage at SNL was the 25th anniversary in 1999, and she was on stage with the entire 86 to 91 cast, Dennis and John and Mike Myers, and they introduced this. Phil had just passed, a year earlier, and her and John introduced Love is a Dream and spoke about, how important it was. And it kind of shows this beauty between these two. And then sadly, 15 years later, Bill Hader and Kristen Wiig, the night Jan passed, go on stage and introduce the same piece. And that just speaks to, how important these two were to each other. And there's not a bit of comedy in this. This was, just sweet, melancholy. This older couple older woman who goes into the bank, into the safe deposit box, and looks at this tiara that she had worn when she was a young woman, and she, remembers, and it's, Phil, of course, and he's singing as Bing Crosby. It's a movie from the 40s, Emperor's Waltz, I believe it was called, and they just kind of dub over, and he seems like he's singing to her, and then she sings to him. And then it cuts back to, the current time, and she's an old lady, and she leaves this bank, and there's Phil standing outside the building as, the security guard, and he winks at her. So it was just very poignant, something SNL didn't dive into very often. And, Schiller was really good at this, making the films. But this was one of his masterpieces, and the fact that it's these two people who we lost way too early is even more so.
Yeah, definitely. Every so often, the show would do something that, as you mentioned, didn't have comedy in it. Sometimes it was a Tom Schiller video. I think Schiller was behind the John Belushi movie as well. And I don't know if I remember much comedy.
Not really. I mean, it was played tongue in cheek, but
but it wasn't like a slap in the face comedic. And Love is a Dream was definitely played for just being a heartfelt thing, and that just goes to show with not only Phil but with Jan just how beloved they both were. That there didn't have to be any jokes in this. We could just see two people who had definite chemistry and that they loved each other, but just like in a friendly way. Jan and Phil loved each other, and that just came across so beautifully.
Absolutely.
In Love is a Dream. So if anybody hasn't seen that or hasn't seen that in a while, go check that out for sure.
Definitely.
My favorite, we've talked about some of Jan's famous sketches, Sweeney Sisters, Attitudes, Love is a Dream, her Tammy Faye Baker impression. My favorite thing that Jan did on the show was the Betty Davis video will sketch. To me, if someone was to ask me, what do you love about Jan Hooks, I would show them the Betty Davis video will sketch.
That's right.
Do you have any memories of that Betty Davis sketch?
Well, as you'll know, earlier this season, Keenan did a video will in an episode, and the best part about it was that it brought people back to this Betty Davis sketch, because they're like, well, Keenan did this really well, but let me show you something that's even a little bit better. And, her Betty Davis impression was fantastic. Late in life, Betty Davis, angry at the world. And
angry at her daughter specifically for writing a tell-all book.
Right.
Yeah.
Hated the lawyer too, but and they, it was this video will after her death, and, her children are called into the office and, have to sit through this painstakingly long video of her talking about the old days in Hollywood and, going off on tangents. And finally, Nora, as her daughter, says, just fast forward through this. And, this is the technology of the late 80s. They pretend to fast forward the tape, and you hear, anybody who hasn't had a VCR, the scanning noise, and little do we know at the beginning of this that's Jan also making that noise. And the only way we know is by the third or fourth time they do this, they cut back to her too quickly. And there's Jan going, but immediately recovers, goes back into the Betty Davis voice, and doesn't miss a beat. And it's just a tour de force of comedy. And, eventually gets to the end of it and says that, Nora's not getting anything, and she hates her for writing a book about her, and she laughs hysterically for ad infinitum. So just a perfect sketch in every way.
Yeah, and that rewatching it made me realize that she might be the best maniacal laugher in SNL history, or one of the best.
Absolutely.
Because that laughing that she was doing as Betty Davis at the end of that sketch was just amazing. I could not laugh like that, but she was just keeping it going, and oh god, that was so great. And I think it was appropriate that you said that Nora Dunn as her daughter was totally left out of the will, but the person who was given all the money was her son, who was played by Phil Hartman.
Right, and it's the perfect encapsulation also of that era. There were no superstars. They were all so great, and the fact that John Lovitz as the lawyer and Phil and Nora as the children are just playing these very straight people, not a laugh among them. She gets all the laughs, and, it just worked out that the next sketch, somebody else would get the laughs. And it never seemed to be an issue with who was going to be the king or the queen of the show. And that's why I think it's the best era of SNL for sure.
Yeah, it's certainly the era, Jan was on from 1985, 86 to 1991. Yeah, and that was definitely the era that was my cast too. So Jan was definitely a huge part of that. So are there any other characters or sketches that we need to talk about as far as her Hall of Fame candidacy?
Well, I think the only other thing I would bring up, and it also speaks to how great she was and how important she was to the show. So in 1991, she decides to leave. Now, this is a different era of SNL, where if you were going to do something else, a movie, a TV show, a directing gig, you pretty much had to leave the show. Lauren wasn't going to let you split your time, and she was going to do Designing Women. So she left the show. But then she was on the show 9 more times from 92 to 94 as Hillary Clinton, and was always credited as a special guest. And I believe that this is the only time in the history of the show that a former cast member was credited as a special guest. Now, obviously, Tina came back, and we've had multiple cameos
Maya
and things
Rudolph,
of that nature.
most recently, yeah.
Right. But I think this was really the only time that someone in the opening credits was credited as a special guest that was a former cast member. That's how important she was to the show. And she came back to play Hillary, a beginning of the Clinton era, to Phil's Bill. Yeah. And we've seen Amy and Kate over the last, 15, 20 years have their own wonderful take on Hillary Clinton. But she was the first. And, it's a more subtle, keep saying subtle here. It was a more subtle impersonation. It was, an earlier version of what we came to know, but she still played it very well. And the fact that they needed her to come back and play this instead of any of the female cast members was a testament to her.
Yeah, definitely. Very memorable as the first Hillary Clinton on SNL. So the two most prominent things I think she did after SNL, you mentioned Designing Women. She was on for a couple seasons, and she also was on Third Rock from the Sun in the late 90s there. Appeared in a couple of episodes of 30 Rock, actually, as Jenna Maroney's mom.
Yes.
Which I think was wonderful casting. And Tina Fey does this. She had cast Buck Henry as her dad, as Liz Lemon's dad in 30 Rock. She cast Jan Hooks as Jenna's mom. Nice little nod to SNL history from Tina.
Oh, without a doubt. And Tina said as much that, Jan was one of her main influences. And Jan, sadly, towards the end of her life, wasn't working very much for whatever reason.
Maybe stage fright? We had alluded to stage fright. I wonder if...
I think that was part of it for sure. I think she had other illnesses that she was dealing with, but apparently she was working just enough to keep her health insurance, her SAG health insurance. But somehow Tina talked her into doing 2 episodes, and I'm so glad that she did, because we got to see her one more time as this incredible tour de force.
Yeah, that was such an exciting, as a big 30 Rock fan.
Oh,
of course, yeah, I think both of us are probably big 30 Rock fans. That was such an exciting thing to see Jan Hooks pop up on the screen.
Yes.
Like, it was like I was a kid again.
That's
watching
right.
her on SNL. It was so awesome.
Yeah.
So she passed away, sadly, October 9th, 2014. I know that hit me like a ton of bricks. There have been certain deaths, like Phil Hartman's hit me hard. Chris Farley hit me hard. Jan did too. There was just something so endearing about her. I assume that had a big effect on you.
Oh, same. I mean, I'm not embarrassed to say she was one of my first crushes, and she definitely got me into comedy. That whole cast of 86 to 91 was so important to my life and who I became, and my sense of humor. And Jan was such a huge part of that. That was devastating when we lost her.
Yeah, definitely. And Jan's one of the cast members that people seem to speak most glowing about over the years. Like, it reminds me of how people talk about Gilda Radner in a way. Just people loved her. And, why do you think Jan is so loved? And I guess by extension, why do you think she's a good candidate for the SNL Hall of Fame?
I think she just had this incredible respect of her peers, and not just the people that she worked with, but the people that came after her. I mean, I think you can draw a pretty straight line from Jan to Molly Shannon to Kristen Wiig, all the way to Heidi Gardner. I think one of the reasons I love Heidi Gardner so much in this current cast is she reminds me so much of Jan. She doesn't always have to have the spotlight on her. She's a chameleon in the roles that she plays. And this was something that Jan was all about as well. Going all the way back to, Lorraine Newman has said she is the most important person in SNL history.
Wow.
Now, she's an original, not ready for primetime player.
Yeah,
and
Lorraine's been around some important people in SNL history.
Worked with Belushi and Aykroyd and Chevy and Bill Murray and Gilda, and says that. So I think that's testament to, the kind of person that Jan was, a singular talent, and that's why I think she belongs in the Hall of Fame for sure.
Wow, well said. And thank you so much, Bill. I knew you were the guy to talk about Jan Hooks. That was a wonderful conversation. So yeah, thanks for joining me.
Yeah, anytime. Thank you.
Jan Hooks. Yeah, Jan Hooks. Jan Hooks, SNL Hall of Famer. How does that sound? To me, that sounds like a lock and a key, and it is a done deal as far as I'm concerned. When I cast my ballot, it will have Jan Hooks' name on it. Absolutely, for certain. What about you? What do you think? That's the important thing here. Have you registered to vote? When the time comes, you're going to need to have registered to vote for your Hall of Famers. And I think it's real important that you do that sooner than later. You can do that by clicking on any of the SNL Hall of Fame links for episodes or on our SNLHOF.com webpage. Now, let's seal the deal here once and for all and play the aforementioned sketch that Thomas and Bill were referring to the hilarious impersonation of Betty Davis. And this is the, I don't know what you would call it, the will reading. We'll call it the will reading. That's what we'll call it, the will reading.
I'd like to offer my condolences. Your mother was a truly remarkable woman.
Yes, she was. There will never be another like her.
Mother and I had our differences, but I'd like to think that in the end, deep down, she loved me very much.
Yes. Well, Miss Davis was a very thorough woman. About a year ago, she sent me a videotape of her last will and testament. And no one has seen it until now.
You mean we're actually going to see our mother?
Yes. Now, this can be very upsetting. Will you be all right?
We'll be fine. Go ahead.
Ladies and gentlemen, Miss Betty Davis.
Hello, Michael. Hello, BT. If you're watching this, it means I've kicked the bucket. And you are with that oily lawyer. He tells me I am worth a lot of money. Well, I don't care. The only thing more trouble than money is a man. And the only thing more trouble than a man was John Barrymore. 1931. Howard Hawks was throwing a party for Edna Ferber. I arrived late and everyone was in the pool. Well, the day before, Jack Warner had given me a hat. You see, we had been at the lounge in the Roosevelt Hotel, and he had lost a bet that Preston Sturgis could hold more cashews in his mouth than me. Well, John Barrymore saw this hat and decided then and there that he did not like it one bit. I had just finished The Old Maid a week before, and it was a dreadful picture. The woman who did my hair was stealing cigarettes from my purse.
Is there any way we could, fast forward?
Yes, to the part about the estate.
All right. Childish pranks. So, no intention of making the picture unless Harry Ritz apologized. I mean, those were perfectly good shoes. And I wanted them back.
Just scan a little further. Just scan a little bit further.
All right. A telegram from Lon Chaney explaining the whole. Nobody. Nobody could make a waffle like Bert Lahr. Now.
We might not need to scan.
Well, yes, that's a good idea. Why don't you just fast forward? Whew, remarkable woman.
Yes, very.
She's seen so much.
Let's check it now.
And Ronald Coleman had sent me a dead owl.
Well, what happened?
Oh, must be the end of take one.
Take one?
Here we go.
Welcome to tape 2. Wallace Beery was in the thick of it. And that's when I knew.
Wait, what's that?
Oh, this is a scene from Dark Victory. Miss Davis was headed it in to make some point.
Lord, I hate that woman.
Oh, I think we've gone too far.
Yeah.
I fell out of my chair. It's just as well, because I just remember the whole point of making this film is to give away my money.
Oh, this is it.
Be quiet, be quiet.
Now let me see. Michael, you get everything. Barbara, you get nothing. Because you wrote a nasty, tell-all book, and I have a bad life.
I get nothing? Well, this just can't be right. I've seen enough. I don't need to see anymore.
Barbara, there may be some specifics.
Forget it. Forget it.
Have you got anything to eat?
Yeah, I have some milk duds.
Great.
You want me to scan this part?
No, this is fine. Man, she's good.
Yes, remarkable woman.
A remarkable woman indeed. In this case, though, we're talking about Jan Hooks, not the late Betty Davis. What else can I say? The ball is in your court now. Will you choose to enshrine her in the hall? We shall see. I hope you do, because she certainly belongs. That's what I got for you this week. Next week, we'll be back with the host category, and we'll be talking about the divisive. At one point, certainly not divisive, but certainly now the divisive Alec Baldwin. So stay tuned for that. But in the meantime, turn out the lights on your way out. The SNL Hall of Fame is now closed.
Thanks for listening to the SNL Hall of Fame podcast. Make sure to rate, review, share, and subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. Follow us on social media at SNLHOF. This is Doug Denant saying, see you next week.
Podcasts and such.